Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today I'm joined with Jeff Hewlett. How you doing, Jeff?
Hey, great, Kurt. Glad to be on your program. Love what
Y-
you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to have you here. And this is exciting. I always like to have, as they say in Boston, wicked smart people here on the show. So, Jeff, tell us a bit about your background before we begin, so the listeners get to know you.
So, kind of starting a little bit at the beginning, I am my background academically is finance, mathematics, and economics. So that's sort of the path I went through. But I applied that almost to completely to banking, consumer banking, commercial banking. But in that part of the world, I did that for about 30 years, basically both on the industry side as well as on the consulting side. So I've worked for some big banks, big consulting firms that you've heard of. But really so that's sort of where where I've spent most of my time really learning and understanding the financial system and really personal finance in a very real way from the kind of the supply side, so to speak. But my real passion and what I was trained for and what I've really returned to is I'm a behavioral economist. In my career, I have performed behavioral economics and testing and randomized control trial sort of work for these large banks, usually on the credit card portfolios, but also in other sort of consumer spaces like home equity and auto and those kind of areas. So, it's really interesting, I find, Kirk, is that, we talk about AI as if it's kind of a new thing. And really, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've basically gone from what I call manual learning to machine learning to now to basically to unsupervised machine learning. But we've been on this path for decades. It's like people say, "Oh, Gen AI, it's new." It's like, well, kind of, but it's really the continuation of something that's been going on for a while. So today I lead. What's called Personal Finance Reimagined. We're a decision-making and financial education platform. So the way to think about it is I've taken a lot of what I've learned from both a behavioral economic standpoint as well from a banking standpoint and really packaged it together to help individuals and people to really be more successful in their financial lives. And it's very eye-opening and sad to me when I look at, say, the wealth distribution of our country. While there's a lot of reasons for that relate to politics and policy and all that stuff, the thing that drives me crazy is we're holding ourselves back, right? It's really a mental challenge in many ways. And so anyway, so in my little part of the world, that's what we're very focused on to tell folks with decision making and financial education.
Nice. Well, I want to get into a few topics you mentioned, but the wealth distribution is an interesting one. I think I mean, you don't, you said you understand the financial system. You must be the guy who knows it because it's so complicated and deep that, anytime I hear a news reporter say, "Oh, well, this is why this happened," like, you don't have no idea. Like,
Right,
it's so deep and vast that no single person would know that. But
right.
you talked about wealth distribution, and it's, it's obviously a hot topic because there's haves and have-nots, as there always is. But we're in a more bipolar world. So what do you attribute the wealth distribution disparities to? Like, is there a single thing or multiple things, or how would you attribute it?
Well, where I start, and I'm one of those people that I'm a behavioral economist, which basically means I know enough about neuroscience and behavioral psychology to be very dangerous. There are better neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists than I am for sure, but part of what we do is kind of very focused on that area. And in some ways, behavioral economics is the presentation of those disciplines. So the way I look at the world is the wealth distribution starts with the challenge of evolutionary biology and the things that we're focused on, things like our attention and things like biases that keep us, like we're literally still running from the lion or still fighting that rival tribe member that our evolution taught us to do 2,000 years ago, and it hasn't caught up. And of course, evolution moves very slow. It will never catch up, right? So it kind of starts with our brains do absolutely work against us. But then you sort of step beyond that and you say, but consumerism, consumer society does not help whatsoever. If anything, consumerism is sort of taking advantage and sort of hacking or tweaking what they know is a challenge. They call it marketing, but if you really think about what marketing's doing, it is really taking the human psychology, sort of disaggregating it, and then really preying on it to get them to buy something today, right? So we have our nature through our genome, and then you add on top of it consumerism, and those two things alone, I put it, like 70 to 80% of the problem, right? And really what I'm doing with Personal Finance Reimagined, and like when I'm teaching in the classroom at James Madison, that's what we're really talking to the students about, is like, hey, this is not a you don't understand mortgage problem, right? This is creating a consistent, repeatable decision process that helps you understand what's important to you so you can apply it to buying a house, buying a car, getting your investment set up, getting a checking account, blah, blah, blah. And so anyway, but that's, you know, that's where I see the real challenges for personal finance.
Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is I'm a caveman. We're all cavemen, and from an evolutionary biology perspective. So how do we kind of get rid of those tendencies in an environment where
Right.
we're trying to be polished and we're trying to be smart and intellectual, and yet we're still subject to our baser instincts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One of the things that we focus on with the students is habits, right? So, you can have good habits, bad habits, but the truth is a habit is basically an overpowering of a neurobiological instinct, right? So we are taught, right, or our neurobiology we brought into the world with run from the lion, right? Grab resources now, today, buy today, basically. That's what we're brought in. So to overpower that, and I'm careful, you don't change your neurobiology per se, you adapt it. And so that's the power of habits, right? And so the habits of saving, for example, I know it probably sounds a little cliche, but truly setting down those habits where they become to the point where you feel bad if you don't do it, right? Like think about it, like a workout. When you start working out, you kind of hate it, right? Because you're doing something that you're not used to doing. But once it becomes a habit, you hate not doing it. You hate not getting up at 6 a.m. to get to the gym, right? And it's the same with personal finance. It's creating those habits. Now, what I do as a behavioral economist, I bring in something else, and it's called the commitment device. And you may have heard of Richard Thaler. He wrote a book called Nudge, but it's kind of that nudging idea. But if it's really hard to do the thing that we know we should do, but it's hard to do, commitment devices help with that. So, for example, a robo-advisor is a really helpful way for after-tax investing to get done, right? And to set up diversified portfolios. I've used Wealthfront, Betterment, Fidelity, Schwab. We focus on a lot of those. I don't necessarily say which one's better or worse, but there's a lot of good ones out there, right? But the key is getting the money from your savings into the robo and setting up the robo so it does what it does do. So that's sort of, I call it the first mile problem, right? Getting your money from your savings account or checking account that you have for your employer and then getting it into the robo. That's literally 90% of the problem. After that, you've set the robo up, you set it, forget it, and money goes in and you get the advantage of compound interest and the time value of money. But it's that first mile problem that people trip up on.
Yeah, no, it's to be fair, I still hate going to the gym at 6 a.m. in the morning. So just wanted to be clear on that. Uh, no, I love the perspective because I think, we all need to create our little habits, supporting habits. You call them commitment devices. I totally agree. I think, we need to be able to be in charge of our, I like to think of it as, we're basically hardware that's run by software, and we need to be able to train our software on how to run on the hardware. And
Mhm.
if you don't know how to program the software, then you're in trouble, right? And you're running somebody else's software. Um,
Right.
But yeah,
Absolutely.
I always wonder about the robo advisor. I think it's a great tool, but I always wondered about things like, well, they just came out with this idea. Robo advisors aren't new either. Like
Right.
the concept of a robo advisor was basically just repackaged. It used to be just diversified portfolio. Now it's packaged as robo advisor. It's the same thing. It's just we came out with a new name and it's trendy. Um,
Right.
which also is a Wall Street fun fact, is they always try to repackage things. ESG
Yep.
used to be what was it? Socially responsible investing, I think was back in the late
Right.
90s.
Right.
So
Right. Right. Right.
same thing, just different name. They got better at it, but all right. So it's interesting because you talked about marketing, and I always looked at marketing. It 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 was always a step ahead of people, and it was always like a little bit dangerous. But I feel like marketing has gotten so good at
Hmm.
understanding the human nature that
Right.
it's like very dangerous. Like the things
Hmm.
that it's able to basically brainwash people if you have good enough marketing. So
Right.
how do people protect themselves against that? Because, and I'll put another layer on it, it's not necessarily finance related, but it relates to finance in a way, is that,
Hmm.
we've gotten so good at understanding how the human mind works and how to basically brainwash people. Like the media, corporate media does it, marketing does it. Like they all understand it well enough where they can get whatever they want. How can we as
Right.
consumers protect ourselves from the? I don't want to
Yes.
call it nefarious because it's more selfish. Like they want you to buy their product. How do we
Right.
protect ourselves from that type of high level, you know, persuasion?
Yes. Well, great question. So let's talk for a second a little bit about the decision process, if I could, because
Hmm.
I think it really relates to your question, but a little bit of a build. So think of it like a systems model, right? Input, process, output, right? So data goes in, then you have a decision process, and then your decision, your action comes out of it, right? And so if you think about today, marketing, let's take, and I'll take as example, a big financial data provider like NerdWallet, right? So NerdWallet provides information about different accounts. Like you want to learn what's the top 10 best rate mortgage or whatever. You go out, they give it to you. Of course, they've got lots of advertising. You can't really tell who's paying to have their stuff there versus what's real. But either way, it's information. Now that information has been monetized, and they're real upfront about it. So yeah, we're getting paid for this stuff. Yeah, so so that, but that's, and I'm picking on NerdWallet a little bit, but there's lots of, and the reason they have a business model around that is because they found a way to monetize data. But remember, data is the input to the decision process. What we do, what I do, whether it be through my class and my organization, is we focus on the decision process. So the whole notion of a consistent, repeatable decision process is really to give people the tools to first decide what's important to them. It's like a personal utility model, if you're familiar with economics, right? It's also known as a criteria model. So what is important to you about the decision? So before you go to NerdWallet, right, or before you start hunting for data, or even you open the door to let data just wash over you like a flood, which is really the way it is today, you get your decision model down first, right? So if you get flooded with a million pieces of data, you already have your decision model in place. So you know the three things that are important to you. So you can go, I'll take that one, I'll take this one, I'll take that one, right? And so what we really push on is how to kind of beat the advertisers at their own game is really through decision process. And we have tools, and we have lots of ways of helping students and users or whatever build those decision models, but that's our focus. So what I'll tell you is order of operations matters. Before you go into make a decision, get your decision process really down first before you open the door to data, because data, some of it's good, most of it's irrelevant, and some of it is meant to deceive. And unless you know what is important to you, opening that door up to all that data, it's just going to confuse you, and it's just going to or confuse anybody, and cause a real struggle to make a good decision.
Yeah, I think that's good. I appreciate that. I think having good models to use is a good way to think about decisions. You also mentioned AI because in the same line of thinking, you mentioned AI earlier as just being a iteration of what's already happened. And I started to chuckle to myself because a lot of the AI out there is not really AI. It's just what it
Right.
was before. And they just put
Right.
AI on the name just to make it sound good. It was good
Sounds
marketing.
sexy, right? Well, you
Right.
mentioned, the whole robo-advisor thing. When you really get into the robo-advisor, it's actually not AI at all. It's really just a set of rules that, like you said, has basically it's repackaging, creating diversified portfolios and putting a different name on it. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much far down the rabbit hole you've been, but like, when I've been start doing a lot of deep research on AI and the applications of it, and it really scares the crap out of me that, all of us are gonna be out of jobs because except for the
Right.
human interaction element, it's really going to change quite a bit and quickly, I think is the challenge.
Hmm.
It's not the fact it's going to change it because we as human beings are, people said the same thing about the printing press and you're like, oh, they lose lots of jobs. Like, yeah, we
Right.
adapt. The problem is the speed of change is so quick. The
Right.
adaptation is going to be really challenging, I think, for a lot of people. What I wonder is because I was listening to a guy talk about this who's big on persuasion, he teaches on it, and he was talking about AI, and he said, he was playing around with AI. He's like, I'm afraid because AI is actually much better at persuasion than people are. If you teach it some of the
Right.
rules, it's gonna be persuading you all day long because you're gonna have your own private AI. And so I guess I wonder when we think about things like that, how should how much agency should we as people give a tool versus doing it ourselves? Because there's a line there that keeps getting blurred as we get more, cyborg like because we have a phone
Right.
attached to our ear when we didn't used to. So we're becoming cyborg like even though it's not technically attached. So how much agency do you give these new tools versus actually doing it yourself so you can make the decisions?
Right. Yeah. No, no, I think I hear what you're saying. And to some degree, like the decision-making tools we use is not automation. It actually, the way the tools work is we actually leverage so people let me put two kinds of decisions in front of you, and this will help explain it. So a binary decision. Like, let's say you go to an eye doctor. They're not going to put like 10 lenses in front of you. The way they do it is they hold up one lens and say, this one or that one, this one or that one, right? Why do they do that? We are incredibly good because of our evolutionary biology at binary decisions. We just are. And what we're really bad at is those here are 10 lenses or here are 10 cars or here are 10 houses, right? We're really bad at complex decisions where you're trying to combine your criteria and really it's a multiplication problem, right? So what we've done with our decision process is we've reduced it to a series of binary pairwise comparisons. And so what we're really doing with our process, we actually don't necessarily make it that much easier. In some ways, it's a little harder, but it's harder in the right way that helps you make a good decision. So when you go through your criteria model, what's important to you about buying this car? We're literally putting two things in pieces of criteria in front of you at once, and you move a slider. That's how our neurobiology works, our evolutionary biology works. So to me, it's almost like going back to basics. Like, how are people naturally good at making decisions? And how do we align a decision process? So, not like say, hey, I wish you were a computer, right? Well, you're not. We're not, right? We're human. And so let's align it to what we're naturally good at, which are these binary decisions. So, anyway, to kind of answer your questions, how do we keep agency? In my mind, agency comes from that alignment with how we already naturally make decisions. So our technology around this is very much that way, right? And we've worked very, very hard on making it that way. So we seek not to confuse at the end of the day, whereas sometimes I feel like data is the agent of confusion.
Yeah. No, that's good. No, I appreciate that. It's a good way to think about it. So let me pivot a little bit and talk about some mental models or cognitive biases. One of the challenges we were talking about before the show is, we our country has a whole generation of people, I shouldn't say it's most people are not good at personal finance. Um, and people talk about where that comes from. I think there's probably multiple reasons, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like why we're so bad at personal finance and what cognitive biases hinder us in our
Right.
getting better at it.
Well, there's so just to put a little bit of context around it, cognitive bias is basically we have our natural way of making decisions, and then we have sort of the world around us, and it creates a disconnect between the information we receive and how we make decisions with it versus kind of what a call it an objective decision would be. So it's a very natural disconnect. Now, the reason that exists is for our evolution, right? It had everything to do with I want to be good at running from the lion because if I didn't, I'd get eaten and I wouldn't have kids, and my DNA would cease to get proffered beyond me. So that let's face it, our evolutionary biology is all about keeping us alive long enough to have children, and that's it. That's like that, like that's the whole deal of our genome, right? So that's a good thing, but the problem is in today's world, we've accelerated so quickly, and the speed of information has so gone beyond what we need to stay alive that right we create these challenges for ourselves. Now, personal finance, if there's probably hundreds of cognitive biases that have been identified. Kind of the granddaddy is called confirmation bias, but I'll set that aside for now. But one very specific one that relates to personal finance is called availability bias. And availability bias is simply what is available to me today, and you put higher weight on that naturally as a value than things that happen into the future. And here's the classic example. In the United States, we have a college finance system, education finance, right? College loans, basically. It is run by the Department of Education, and basically the way it works is they put a loan package in front of a high school student and their parents. They go through a process, and what ends up coming out of that is based on their financial wherewithal and any public assistance they can get. They end up with an EFC, or an expected family contribution. So basically, the government will fund the gap between what the parents and public assistance can kick in, and that gap with the student loans. Two kinds of student loans: subsidized, unsubsidized. But either case, the bottom line is it doesn't have to be paid back until 6 months after you graduate. So think about what the Department of Education has done, right? They have completely tapped into availability bias, right? So what they've done is they've taken that 17-year-old and their parents, and said, hey, you're not going to have to pay for anything for 5 years. And you can go to any college almost in America, whether it's a state school, a community college, or think of the most expensive private school you can think of, right? With massive differences in amounts. All that sort of difference in cost has been completely taken off the table by the Department of Education, right? They're preying on availability bias. It's hard to think that our own government's doing this, but that is the nature. That is probably the most extreme case of availability bias that I can think of any bank, right? So if you think about the way a bank works, if you take out a loan, you got to start paying it back right away, right? But not the Department of Education, right? They put on they basically say, we're going to take away and we're going to prey on your availability bias. And so fast forward, why do you think we have had double-digit inflation in the United States in college? Duh. Or why do you think that we have, in aggregate, almost 20% default rate? Think about that. 1 in 5 Americans almost default on their student loan at some time in their life. Well, no kidding. They got suckered into the availability bias, and as a result, 1 in 5. No bank in the country could stay in business if they had a 20% default rate. but the US government just keeps on, doing what they do. So it's a challenge. Now, to be fair, 20 plus years ago when they started, costs were much lower. Nobody had the foresight to think about, well, what happens if the cost of education, if higher ed grows at double to triple the rate of inflation for 20 years? It's going to become ridiculously expensive. So back in the day when they first started the program, it really wasn't as big a deal because costs weren't so high. But today, it's kind of like a train out of control. So anyway, so that's my example of how cognitive biases impact. That's kind of the most egregious example, but it happens in lending all the time, right? Because let's face it, that's kind of what lending is structured availability bias.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the college space, I mean, we have one of the hosts, guest hosts in the show, specialized in college. And it's one of the things we talk about all the time is the obnoxious nature of the price of college and what you're getting. I know you're a professor, so I don't want to rip on colleges too much, but I mean, you
Yeah.
probably see it, right? It's these
Yeah.
people, they can't pay it back. They're not getting a valuable degree.
Right.
And when I mean valuable degree, they're valuable, but you're not getting an ROI on it.
Right.
I think somebody did a study maybe 5 years ago that showed that you're actually going to get negative ROI for your college degree now. Like it didn't used to be, but it's gotten so expensive. I mean,
Right.
some colleges are like 100 grand a year. It's
Right.
crazy.
And you talked about marketing.
Yeah.
Um, college marketing is the worst, right? Like Harvard would have you believe that going to and I pick on Harvard, but really any selective college, their whole marketing game plan is how can I convince people that this selective college is actually worth paying more for? And what's interesting is I used to be a lead recruiting partner for one of the big four firms, and I can tell you the way we recruit, the selectives, first of all, they're too small. And second of all, we recruit generally broadly across many universities, and we focus on GPA. It's kind of that simple. We look for the best students we can find within a college while going to many colleges. No college has like the monopoly on smart kids. They just don't. So, that's a really weird sort of the whole marketing thing around selective colleges is another like this really weird cultural falseness. I mean, complete falseness. And just based on how employers hire. They do not just go to Harvard. Right.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's funny. I have a lot of friends that go to Harvard, and I've asked them this question over time. I said, is Harvard a good school because there's smart people going there, or is it a good school because it teaches people to be smart? Is it the chicken or the egg? And,
like,
you know, I mean, there's the name, right? The name is the name. It's like if you go out, if you're on the West Coast, you've got Stanford, right? Or,
right.
Berkeley or whatever. Like you naturally are going to gravitate. People want the smart kid. But it was funny. I was talking to a few employers after I got employed, and they said, "Oh, we actually won't even talk to Harvard kids. We won't even
Right.
talk to them because we want hard workers, and some of the kids aren't.
Right.
And it's not that they're not hard working; it's just there's all these biases that people have about that. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
at the end of the day, what was it? Somebody actually put this very succinctly. It said the reason you go to Harvard, or not Harvard, college, is to show that you can do work. Like
Yeah.
employers want to see that
Yeah.
you can show up on time, you can take a test, you're
Right.
responsible. Like
Right.
that's what they want to see, right?
That was Sylvester Stallone, by the way. I love that. He does a movie quote. It's only like 30 seconds long. It's literally, Sylvester Stallone doing college. But yeah,
Oh, that's
that's
good. Yeah, I actually didn't see him say that. I want to go look it up now.
yeah. No,
Uh,
it's in like one of his recent, I don't know if it's a TV show or movie, but yeah, it's all for that reason. And what I'll tell you too about, again, from me as a hiring manager, um, going to college and getting a good GPA. Colleges do not give out good GPAs. But why we care about GPA isn't because you're smart. The fact that you got into that college pretty much makes you smart enough. What it proves is you could apply sustained effort for 4 years. It demonstrates resilience. That's what the misunderstanding. That's what companies need. hard workers, but somebody who can take the uncertainties in the left and the right and dealing with hard clients. That's what getting a good GPA at a college proves, in my mind, at least.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think there's obviously some elements to it, and but I constantly reflect on this. Your college degree basically gets you your first job. After that, no one really cares unless, if you're a doctor or an attorney or somewhere where grade
Right.
actually matters. But for most employers, it's like, oh, you did a good job. They hire you, and then that's it. Then your
Right.
next job is about your last job, and so on and so forth. So it's a very
So when
expensive first job.
one of the things we do is we talk to part of our program is doing seminars for high school kids, right? And part of our focus, our decision making focus, kind of, one of the things we really focus on is decisions that are very relevant because learners learn best with a decision that's near and dear to their heart, right? So if I went to high school and talked to them about buying a house, they look at me like I have two heads, right? But what I do is I say, we're going to talk about the college decision as a personal finance decision. Okay. And that gets their attention. They're like, oh yeah, I got to go to college or I got to do something after high school, right? I can't stay here, after I'm 17 or 18. So we do talk a lot about what you were saying before, college ROI, right? And it's all about, to really simplify it, spend as little money as possible, graduate, and get a good GPA. And nowhere in there did I say which school you should go to. Go to the school that you can graduate from and get a good GPA to help you get a good job. So let's find that school, right? And it turns out it's probably a state school. It could include community college as a low cost bootstrap to a 4-year college. Nobody cares how you got your degree. So if you went to, like I teach at James Madison, so if you went to James Madison and you went through Blue Ridge Community College to get out of there, to get a 4-year degree from JMU, okay, right? And if anything, what's interesting, to take it even the other direction, community college is actually a resilience signal, right? If you think about it, it's hard to transfer in with no friends at the end of your sophomore year into your junior year. Everybody has their friends set, right? So that's hard. That takes resilience, right? So to me, if you graduate from a JMU or any like residential college and you went through the community college system, saved a ton of money in the process, you're both financially smart and you're probably more resilient than most.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Um, cool. So, now what other cognitive bias should people be thinking about when it comes to finance? I mean, there's so many, but what are some of your other
Yeah,
favorites?
well, we focus on, time discounting, right? So one of the things that I put in front of the students is the typical convex time value money curve, which is that, increasing at an increasing rate. That's really hard for people. We are linear thinkers. We are actually binary thinkers, back to the whole evolutionary, pairwise comparison thing. We have two dots and I go straight line between one dot and the other dot. That's the way our brains work. So the whole idea, the intuitive idea of increasing at an increasing rate, which is that time value money curve, is a bias called time value bias, basically, or time discounting bias. So that's a very natural thing, and that's one. Again, you don't beat it, you kind of overpower it, right, with your habits. In other words, you're not going to change your brain the way it operates. You will forever, left to your own devices, have this bias, right? But there are ways to overcome it with the tools and the habits and the things that we teach. Is a good part of it. I mentioned confirmation bias. That's kind of the granddaddy. It's a very baseline cognitive bias that really kind of has upward tentacles into all these other biases. The example actually I give for that is, in January of 2021, when the U.S. Capitol was attacked, right? After the Trump election, and Biden was trying to take office. So we talk about that, and we use that example in class. That whole commission that was put together, bipartisan commission, they went through it and they basically said social media and legacy media were basically feeding false information to people to believe that there was a problem with the election when there wasn't, right? That is the ultimate example of confirmation bias, right? It's a group of people that were already kind of supporters of the current administration, right? They were looking for ways to confirm what was going on. So we use that as an example. That's kind of a little bit of a historical political example, but it really speaks to, focusing on things like beliefs, right? And belief updating is super important. And, people aren't naturally good at belief updating. I don't know if you've ever heard of a fellow named Phil Tetlock. Philip Tetlock wrote the book called Super Forecasting. I don't know, about 10 years ago. It's a wonderful book, kind of famous in certain circles. But he said that beliefs are not treasures to be guarded, but are hypotheses to be updated, right? Or hypotheses to be considered. So his whole thing is we think about beliefs all wrong, right? We fight to support our beliefs. Where if we're like really kind of science minded, we would say, hey, that person has a different perspective. Let me interrogate, think about what their perspective is. It's different than mine, and then I'll use that piece of information to update, right? Kind of like Bayesian inference or something. And people just aren't naturally that way, and that's to me some of the disconnect.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're tribal creatures. We want to fit in, and it's funny you say a lot of that. I mean, I hate talking about politics, so we don't talk about it in the show. But I use politics frequently as an example because
Right.
it's so obvious to a lot of people
Right.
once you use it. So I'm. It's funny you say that the influence of corporate media and social media. I think I mean that's one of the things we talked about earlier, and we talk about a lot in the show is that's really the danger, right? Is you have a, I think what's interesting is the generational impacts. So the baby boomers and later are accustomed to believing corporate media because they always have, and it didn't lie to them. Well, much. It always did, but
Yeah.
it didn't lie to them as much.
Right.
It was believable. We all collectively believed it. But the younger generation, starting with mine, Generation X, right, is we are non-believers. We don't trust or believe institutions because that we're latchkey kids. And then you got the younger generations, they see through it too.
Right.
Um, I was on a cruise with my parents, God, it must be like 15, 20 years ago, something like that. And I was on the cruise and I was having dinner with this couple from the UK. And I think now it must have been earlier back than that because Bush was president. And no, it was Bush the second. That's what it was. And so I said, so what do you think of the US? Because I was just curious. I'm just like,
Yeah.
because I know everyone in the media was saying, oh, everyone hates the US. The globe hates the US. So I asked them, I said, what do you think of the US? And they're like, we love you guys. You guys are great. I love the US. I love the citizens. We just don't think much of your leader. I was like, okay. Like that's interesting, right? And
Yeah.
and so I kept talking to them and I said, well, it's funny because our media keeps telling us that they hate the US. And they started laughing and they're like, you silly American. Like, you're the only country that believes that your media is not dishing you propaganda. Everyone else in the
Right.
world knows their media is propaganda. You guys are the only ones that think
Right.
your media is correct and truthful. It's like,
Yep.
okay, fair point. Everyone else sees it but us.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
no, I think you're right, though. We were kind of trained that way. And, I think of the evolution between I call it broadcast and narrowcast, right? So whereas broadcast, you had four-ish, networks that were feeding you information. There's actually a fair amount of QC. They couldn't get it, but so wrong because there's only four of them and everybody's looking,
yeah,
right? And everybody's looking from both sides of the political spectrum. So a lot of QC going on with broadcast media. And now in narrowcast, it's kind of the opposite. And for some that are way off on the left or right side of the bias spectrum, they've just become political mouthpieces, right? And that are literally feeding the confirmation bias. It's like they've become confirmation bias machines.
I don't want
Um,
to defend them, but don't they have to at this point? Because you're like when the media was a little bit more centrist, and it was always left leaning, and then you got Fox,
right,
which showed it was, like, oh, okay, there's an audience for that. and
Right.
it's started to spread into this extremes. But they basically created echo chambers on the left and on the right that people want
100%.
to hear confirming opinions. So they're brainwashing themselves. So it's
Right.
like chicken or egg. Who created it? And it's like, well, they're filling the need, and these people are going towards
Right.
their primal instincts.
Well, the one thing that we talk to the students about is there is bias in everything. The key the struggle shouldn't be to find completely unbiased sources of information. I think you can find less biased sources of information for sure, but there's always going to be a bit of a lean, and it also could even be the reporter, and so to me, there's always the key is understanding the bias and self-correcting. Right. And but it kind of goes back to what you said, which is, do we even recognize that there's bias, right? And you're probably appropriately said, a lot of Americans don't even get that they're being fed a very biased view of the world. And what we call the reasoning error called a error of omission, right? It's not necessarily that the information's wrong, it's that it is woefully incomplete and is literally stacked on one side of an issue, right? So to me, that's the danger. I mean, there are a lot of fact checkers out there. I don't know that people listen to them,
Yeah, not
especially
anymore.
if the
Yeah,
fact that's
they're
being
biased too.
checked is against what you want to believe already. But the errors of commission are kind of, we have kind of watchdogs for that. Error of omission is very dangerous, right? You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what they're not telling you. And that should be the hunt, right? Is how
Yeah.
do you get that information? And one of the kind of famous scenes from there was a bioptic or something on social media, I can't remember, but the very famous quote was, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right? And that's what I remind my students. Like, you should pay for your information just like you would tip a waiter, right? Because if you're not paying for it, oh, you're paying for it. you,
Yeah.
you just don't know how you're paying for it, is the real challenge. So pay for it, understand what you're paying for, and use that as a way to update your beliefs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's like the Sherlock Holmes story, the dog not barking, right?
Right.
And it always reminds me of that because we don't talk about that enough, but you're right. And I mean, if you actually watch the corporate media, the left or the right, you're going to see a piece of information, you're going to see a story. If you go look at the other side, you won't even see that story anymore. Like they're in there, like there could be a story out, like the Hunter laptop was a big deal, obviously during the election last time, and one side just ignored it, and like they didn't
Right.
even tell their people that this was a story, and it wasn't even looked at because there was the bias in it. You didn't know until after it was true, but it was like completely like you didn't hear about it. Like I think I mentioned it to somebody on the left, they're like, "That's not a story." I'm like, "Yeah, it's on the news," and they're like, "Nah,
Yeah.
it's propaganda." I'm like, but that's the problem, right? You get caught in
Right.
this like how, and this is where I think this is where people start to lose their minds, right? Because we get into this society and we have AI, which
Right.
is effectively run by, it's trained on information that is out there, right? Which is probably all biased anyway.
Right.
And that's without them putting bias in it. It's just everyone's got, like you said, got a bias. So then how do you even know what's right anymore? We've got deep fakes, we've got, all the people around you are biased. No one's giving you the straight truth as best you can.
Right.
So how do you even figure out what's right or not? How do you even know the data is right? I mean, the government jobs, they came
Yeah.
out and there were 900,000 jobs off. Oops.
Right. Oops.
It's a little
Right.
more than an oops, right? It's a
Which is
WTF.
probably actually an honest mistake,
I'm
but
sure it
a
was.
big
Yeah,
mistake, but that,
sure.
that I can give them a mulligan on that. There's actually a really good book written by a fellow named Tim Harford called Data Detective. I think it came out 3, 4 years ago or something. I really enjoyed it. He's like an economics correspondent, so I think in the UK. But anyway, he talks about the time and the consumption of information. So he kind of broke it down into rolling news, daily news, weekly periodicals news, whatever, monthly, and then books, right? And he said that the best way to sort of deal with that sort of information challenge, information overload, and potential information incorrect is to move back your time frame, right? So his like my whole thing now is I really never listen to rolling news. Like my phone doesn't beep at me. I have no idea. There's a lot of stuff that just sort of just is constantly going on. Turn that stuff off. I have literally I said goodbye to the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, their dailies. I even found that's too soon. I still have a subscription to The Economist. I have a couple of monthlies like Wired and Scientific American, but 80% of my knowledge of the world comes through books. In other words, that is the longest curated cycle, and your chance of getting a very holistic view of something that you want to understand is much greater the longer you wait. Is kind of the simple answer, right?
I love that perspective, extending the lens in the time frame. But I
Yeah,
agree, and it's funny. There's been a lot of talk about why podcasts have gotten so popular, and in large part is because society has been getting into the shorter and shorter time frame of information and news, quote unquote news, that there's a craving for long form content like books or podcasts. Like that's
right,
why these podcasts like Hardcore History, like 4 hours long. Like, why would
right.
you listen to a 4 hour podcast? But people do. It's popular
Yeah,
because they're
100%.
craving that depth that we're not getting from news. And
Right,
so I love the perspective. I think it's very valuable in how people should be looking at decision making is not get caught up. I had a few clients I had to talk to this about is what they get caught up in social media. I said, take a week hiatus. No news,
right,
no social media for 1 week and come back and see if you missed anything. I guarantee you didn't.
right.
And it was like,
Exactly.
yeah. And then they're like, after this, like I'm getting off the social media. Like I felt
Yep,
great. It's
yep.
it's a detox.
It,
It's
it is a purge, really.
technology
It's
detox. Yeah.
sad, but yeah, it's
Well,
true.
cool. Well, we got to wrap it up at the interest of time. I'd love to keep talking, and we'll probably have you back on the show at a later time as well. But Jeff, where can people find more about you and tell us about kind of what you're doing right now?
Yeah, so Personal Finance Reimagined is the name of my organization. It's at financerevamp.com is our URL handle. So we're all about decision making and financial education, and we deliver it like in several different ways. Like I mentioned, I'm in the classroom at JMU, but basically what we've done is packaged up. So I have a book that I wrote that's basically the textbook for the class. We have our apps, we have a curriculum. We packaged that up, and we now provide a personal finance full program to other universities. So basically, the way it works is if it's cool because people my age in their 50s, a lot of finance people running around in the world, right? They want to teach, they want to give back. Maybe their kids have, are in college or moved out or whatever. So they got a little more time. Maybe they're winding down on the career. They have all this information, they have all this great knowledge, right? But the last mile challenge is I need a curriculum, a book, and somebody that can maybe hold my hand for my first semester. That's what I do, right? So I love it because I feel like at JMU, it's great, but I feel like I'm in like my little corner of the world in the Shenandoah Valley, and I'm helping that group of students that take my class. I'm really trying to find ways to scale, and that's certainly one way we're doing it. But we do it in a number of different ways. We work with nonprofits, actually. We're now working with a high school program called On the Road, which is up in the Shenandoah Valley that provides basically to low to moderate income first generation families and their high schoolers to help them make the right decision about college. But we sprinkle in personal finance. Like I was saying before, you have to be careful to not overreach based on where a learner is. So we'll talk about checking accounts and some of the basics of personal finance, but how we really pay it off is by driving the decision process to help them make their college decision. But then that's the beginning point, like the blast off point for how they'll use that with other personal finance decisions in the future. Because it is the same process. It's just the details of each one of those personal finance decisions are different. So anyway, so that's what we do. We have some other channels, but that's you know we're very focused on I'll call it behavioral personal finance, right? We're really trying to bring in the idea of we're in an information overload age. I call it information abundance. How we learn personal finance. We never did it quite very well anyway, but now that we've shifted from information scarcity to information abundance, how we teach personal finance has to completely change. And you know, that's, I feel like we're really onto something in our approach, and I'm quite excited about it. And it's really fun, honestly, kind of getting into my behavioral economics roots and really applying some of those cool behavioral economics, you know, skills and abilities, et cetera, to this particular challenge.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, I appreciate you coming on the show. We'll probably have to have you come back on to talk about the evolution of college, because what you're doing here, I think, is where the trend is going, is the conversion, or even the divergence of learning away from colleges, like practical things like what you're talking about. So kudos for your efforts. Well, thank you for coming on the show, sharing your wisdom with us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I love it, Kirk. I really appreciate being on with the Money Tree. You know, I've listened to several of your podcasts. I love your style. It's really cool, and you've had some great guests. So thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks again.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist, because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room, as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room.
All right, that was a great interview with Jeff. Really appreciate him coming on the show. Now we're into the panel portion of our show, and we have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk, happy to be here today. How you doing?
Doing great. Doing great. And I'm very happy to have our returning one of my favorite panelists, Megan Gorman. Hey, Megan.
Hey, Kirk, how can you miss me if I never go away? Right? That's what I tell my husband all the time. So separation makes the heart grow fonder.
Well, glad to have you back, Megan. And Megan's got a new book out, so she's been really busy promoting that. So maybe towards the end, she could talk a little bit about that, because she sent me a copy. And by the way, thank you, Megan, for sending me the copy.
Yeah.
It was great. I'm looking forward to
no,
reading it.
and we should probably chat about it at some point. So
Yeah, and
Been fun.
I'd love to hear more about the recent president's finances, because maybe that's a little more obscure, but it would be very interesting.
I get that question a lot.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about it.
Cool. Well, Phil, what were some of your takeaways from the interview?
One of my favorite things he talked about, because of the fact, especially because of the fact that I do life planning, is when he started to talk about understanding what's important to you so you can apply it to your decisions and to how you do things. I mean, I like to think of it that we have a team, and this is an acronym of capital that we want to allocate and align with our values. So it's like our time, our energy, our attention, and our money. That's what I think about in that context. But it's just so important. if you want to do your financial plan, if you want to do anything with your finances, understanding what matters to you is so important. And it's something that more advisors are starting to do, but there's still a lot that don't. And so if you are looking at working with somebody that can help you with those things, can make a really big difference.
Yeah, I agree. And we'll get into the decision-making process in a bit. Megan, what were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, I'm going to echo the same things that Phil took away. People think that financial planning is all numbers, but it's really about philosophy to me and values and direction. And I think the past decade has focused a lot more on do it yourself with the millennials and Zers coming into the mix and feeling that indexing is the right way to go. Right. And I feel that one of the things that sort of gets moved off the table is the actual depth of advice that really isn't just number driven, but life driven and life planning. And I think you're going to see this a lot more going forward. Life health planning are really key components of managing your money and your money story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So Phil, I know we kind of talked on the show a little bit about college and decision making, and I wanted to kind of dive into it a little bit. But you know, when you're working with clients with life planning, I'm sure college kind of comes into play. But how can you kind of like overlay a framework here for how to make good decisions when it comes around to life decisions like college?
That's a really tough one for a lot of people because you talk to me, I want my kid to go anywhere. And if they can get into Harvard or they can get into an Ivy League school, I'll figure it out. I'll tell you, I have a client. They told me they have one child. They told me when we had this conversation, said, we told her she could go anywhere. And then she picked University of Southern California. And it was $90,000 plus a year. And then they come and say, Phil, how are we going to pay for this? I'm like, I brought this up before. It ended up that his father had money that he could give them that was going to go to them, when he passed. So he helped them. But it's a big problem. I mean, I remember one prospect I talked to, she told me early on, she said she told her daughter if she wanted to major in accounting, she could go to a more expensive school. And she wanted to be, it was English lit or something like that, where the job prospects aren't as good. She wouldn't help her go to that school because you got to think about what the return is. But a lot of times I have the conversation with clients about the idea that a lot of times you go to state schools, especially if you have a good student and they can get into an honors college or something like that, that makes that program the equivalent of going to a really top level school. So think about the idea that what can you afford? And let's put that in your plan. It's not just, oh, we'll figure it out, because then when push comes to shove, maybe you can't. But it is a really important part of it, And if you're going to do it, start saving early, right? Put that money away. And it's all about, and then if you want to do this too, it's all about deciding what are the things that matter to you most. We can decide and allocate our money based upon what we want to do and what's important to us. Like you hear the story, don't spend $15 on a latte, right? If that's really important to you, you can do it, but it just means there's something else you can't do. So you have to understand what it is that's important to you and what's not. And that's really, to me, the whole essence of life planning is understanding and figuring out what those things are that are most important to you. So as I talked about in the open, we want to be able to align how we use our capital with our values and what matters.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great way to look at it. Megan, what are your thoughts when it comes to, life planning around college and how people should be thinking about it nowadays?
Yeah, first of all, it's so hard, right? I had a client do this and it was their idea, and I actually really learned a lot from them doing it. They have one child, and when they were setting up 529 plans, they said basically, look, we don't want to put everything in a 529 plan. We want to save a certain amount of 529 plan and a certain amount in an UTMA, Unified Transfer to Minors Act. And we did this for years. And, by the time the child was like 15, 16, there were significant balances. And then the parents asked him to start meeting with me once a year on these two accounts. And so we would sit there and we would talk about the markets. We would talk about how much spending power he would have for colleges. And as he went through the process of picking his colleges, we would run analysis on, okay, if you go here, you could just use your 529 money and you'll have your UTMA money for other things. Whereas if you go to this school, you'll not only burn through the 529, but then you're going to have to make other decisions on how you're going to finance it. And this guy, the child, and I say child because now he's 25, he was very pragmatic. And when he would see the numbers and absorb them, he sort of would say, well, why would I go and overspend? Like he would ask that of me. And I'd say, well, you don't have to, right? You're just trying to make the right choice for the right school. And so why I bring this up is, when I was researching my book, one of the presidents that fascinated me the most was Herbert Hoover, who learns about money as a child. And I started to get into the guidelines for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on introducing children to money. And we often go to that whole giving them allowance, learning how to have a bank account. But the CFPB has this whole thing on being a financial apprentice. And that between the ages of 14 and 21, you really want them to be taking on more financial skills in terms of actually understanding how borrowing works, building an actual budget if you borrow, and what it would look like if you had to take the money, paying it back. And I think that's one of the things that I've tried to now put into my practice is how is this going to look if we do take on debt? So I think the thing is, I think one of the, going back to what Phil said, I think that financial planning is actually a family thing. It's a family sport. And that you shouldn't be afraid to try to bring your child into the conversation because planners like Phil and Kirk and myself, we're used to this. And I think getting them comfortable with those conversations to really become a quote unquote financial apprentice in making these decisions can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great perspective. I think, the challenging thing about college, at least from my perspective, has always been the FOMO aspect of it, right? Like we have this norm in our culture that people have to go to college, right? You go to high school, then you go to college, and we got to this place where decades ago, not everybody went to college. Now everybody goes to college. And now some people are going to grad school, not everybody, but well, now everyone needs to go to grad school because everyone else is going to grad school. And you get in this FOMO loop that isn't necessarily productive. The challenge I think about is what is the return on your investment for college, right? Like investing in yourself is never a bad investment. But if you're going to spend $1 million to learn a skill that'll make you $10,000, it might be a bad investment, right? And so, it's hard to think about it that way. But in working with so many families, both with Doug and Jack and some other people I work with that specialize in college planning, the challenge is that it's really expensive. It's hard for people to afford nowadays. People inevitably get into debt, and now you have to pay off this debt, and now you're shackled with debt. And not only is it unaffordable nowadays for people to pay for lifestyles, I mean, everything's just more expensive, right? And so I know they talk about was a 23-25% inflation rate in the last few years since COVID. I don't know what that number is illustrating. It's not my life. My life, I mean, food's up 100% for me, at least 100%, maybe more. So I don't know what they're talking about, 20%. I was listening to the vice presidential debate last night, and they're talking about, I think it was like 20 or 25%, the stat that they said. And I'm like, yeah, that's not the average American. Like, you go to the grocery store and things are much, much more expensive. So, I get there's some, tomfoolery going on with government numbers, but the point is colleges have been going up every single year for decades, and they go up a lot. It used to be the average was 7.5%. Now it's kind of curtailed and kind of flattened out. But the most expensive colleges, I think, are just a whisker under 100,000. 100,000 a year for college. What is the return you're going to get on that? It's not very high because everyone's got a college degree. And, if you go to one of the top colleges, or let me rephrase that. If you go to what is perceived to be one of the top colleges, like an Ivy, or there's some other good schools that are Ivies. But if you look at what people perceive as a top college, well, that might have some value in the network and maybe the perceived value, and that'll get you your first job. But after you get your first job, what's really the value of college? There really isn't one unless you're going for a graduate degree or the network, right? But a good college gets you your first job. And if you're not the top of the class or the top school, you're probably not going to get the top job that you could possibly get right out of college. So if you're in that world, right? If you're trying to get, I don't even know if Goldman still has the same cachet it did, but when I was graduating, you got a job at Goldman. That was like you were the smartest kid in the class, and you were lucky to get that job, right? I know Megan has a background there, so she's wicked smart, as we say here in Boston. But that was like the pinnacle.
Or just lucky, Kirk.
We're lucky, yes.
Better lucky than good.
Yes. Well, whatever it is, Megan, it worked. But point being is, if you had another job, management consulting, it might have been Bain or one of these other big firms. The point is, if you're that kind of person that's shooting for the top rung and the best jobs and the best college education, all that, then more power to you. Maybe that's your path. But if you're not, then what is really the value for the 99.9% of society that doesn't fit into that, the top, the smartest of the smart in college and getting that best job? I mean, I went to a good school. I met a lot of great people. I had a good time. I didn't have the top grades in my class, but I had no expectation that I wanted to go to New York and go for the biggest firms. That wasn't my goal. So all I really needed was a college degree to get the first job. And then from there, it hasn't really held much value to me since. I mean, I would say the value would be inconsequential. The minor things of, oh, you went there, cool, I went there. Otherwise, it's inconsequential, right? Now, if you go to BC and you live in Boston, that has some value, right? If you go to BC and you live in California, it doesn't hold much value, right? It's, the location matters. So I always kind of come back to this thought process of, what is the value of a college education? Now, I have young kids, and I'm wondering two things. Is it worth the money to send them to college, right? What is the value of sending them to college? And three things. What is the education they're actually going to get? Nowadays, that's a big open question. Is it worth the education, or is the value there? And third, is college even going to be a thing 20 years from now? Right, with technology, with AI, what is really the value of college? Is it just the diploma? Is the education? Like, what is that going to look like 10, 20 years from now? I mean, my kids are going in 4 years. I'm on the cusp of wondering, like, is it even worth them going to college? Like, what is that going to look like? I don't know. So, I mean, these are all, I think the challenge, and this is the reason I'm bringing it up, I'll circle back, is we don't go through this decision-making process because we're so focused on all of the things that don't hold value. Like, they hold value to you as a person, but not in a logical sense, right? Things like, what are my neighbors going to think? What are my friends going to think? What are my family going to think if my kid doesn't get into the best college, right? It's like it's like something you can hold over other people. Look, my kid went to this school, your kid didn't. Like, it's so silly, but subconsciously we all have that FOMO. We all have that societal, blue ribbon of like, hey, I did this, or my kid did this. It really isn't all that important, but we make it important, right? And the FOMO is a big part of it. It's like, you don't want to be a bad parent because you didn't send your kid to the best school. And you may think that's a silly comment, but subconsciously we're all thinking that, right? We all have that guilt of, ugh, I didn't give it my all to put my kid into the best school, and I'm a bad parent. You may never say that to anybody, but subconsciously you're probably going to think that. Did I do my best for my kid? I mean, if that's part of your decision-making process, that's a problem. because that may not lead you to make the right decisions. It may lead you down a path that now you've got like $500,000 in debt, and it's going to take the kid, or the kid is going to have $500,000 in debt, and it's going to take them a lifetime to pay off. Those are decisions that you're not making because you're so focused on what other people think and not the logical financial part of it. So I just raise that because it gets into this concept of, emotional value, right? Of what's the emotional value you're creating, and what is that meaning for you, right? It does have meaning, right? It's emotions are important, but do they overwhelm a logical decision and make it become a bad decision because you made an emotional decision instead of a logical one? So there's no right or wrong there. It's just something to be mindful of. So Phil, when people go through decision-making process like this, how should people be making smart decisions?
Well, there's a lot of things that I'm thinking about as you're talking, because I had this experience myself. When it was time for me to go to school, I was told go anywhere that I want. And schools weren't as much as they are now. And so I chose to go to Duke, right? Back then, I will tell you that Duke was $10,000, $12,000 a year. Today it's one of those schools, it's over 90. But then because of my father's inability to manage money properly, there was not enough money to pay, and I had to leave for the financial reasons. It changed what I did. And when I went back to school, I went to Rutgers, and I put myself through school on credit cards because I had to pay for it, and that's all I could do. But I look back on that, and that was good debt, right? Because if I didn't have that credit card debt, like I looked and said, oh my God, I paid too much in interest. I got to fix this and make it go away. But without that, I wouldn't be where I am today. And there's a client right now that they have twin daughters. And I remember when we started working together, she said, oh, I'm going to put aside $15,000 a year for them for college. I'm like, I don't think that's enough. And we've been working together for 4 years now. Her daughters are going to be going to school in the fall. They're not working with Doug, but they're working with somebody like that and with me to figure out how much they're going to have to pay. But over time, the amount that she saved has increased and increased and increased. And now their daughters can go to the school, not necessarily wouldn't have been their first choice, but given their budget, this is where it goes. And I've had the conversation even with my own kids, because I have my youngest daughter. I have 4 kids. My youngest is my daughter. She's just started school this year. She's at James Madison, where Jeff is, by coincidence. But I remember when my first son was choosing, I said, well, if you go here, you're going to have to do this to help pay for it. If you go here, where it was less money, not only will I be able to pay for it without your help, you can have a car, you can have money towards a house or something like that, kind of like what Megan was talking about before at the end. So there's a lot of conversations comes back to choice, right? Like the client that I'm talking about with twins, even though I've never met them, their daughters know who I am, because they'll say to her, Mom, does Phil say we can do this? Because she has talked to them about this process and this decision. And it's part of it's part of the family decision. It's really not just picking, it's not just up to the child, and it's not just up to the parent. You have to look at your situation and decide what makes the most sense for you and your family. Because I remember one of my first clients, they came to me, and they were the kind you talked about, right? They came to me, they had so much debt, and most of it was student loan debt, right? And it says she's been working for a not for profit, so she's able to take advantage of, she does that for 10 years, her debt can be forgiven. The balance she has to pay along the way. But these are really important decisions, and nobody ever had that conversation, because to end up at school and owe hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's really not a good situation. It puts you behind in so many ways in your life. And so we make these decisions because, look, I admit, when I decided to go to Duke, is because I went to campus. The campus was beautiful. Like, this is where I want to go to school. And I could have gone to UNC, and I know that's a big rival, but the cost was less than half. And with the benefit of hindsight, that's where I should have gone. But it's all okay, because I'm where I am today. I'm very happy to be here. It's not like I would go back and redo it, but I'm just saying, if I looked at it with the proper thought process, I would have picked the school that was almost as good and was a lot more affordable, because then I could have taken care of it myself and I wouldn't have had all those other things happen. So all these decisions have big impacts. So it's important to have these conversations with your kids. Make sure that they understand, here's the implication. Say, hey, if you go to this school that's less, maybe there's something else that comes out of it on the other side. Like your example, Megan, was so good because he had the choice, right? If I go to an expensive school, I'm going to dip into my UTMA or maybe make it go away. And if I go to the cheaper school, I don't have to. And so that helps to put some of the onus for the decision on them to help that have them be an active part of the process and start to make choices, because it's really important. Our schools don't really teach this stuff very well.
Right.
So whether it be parents or financial advisors, whoever, it's important to have somebody that helps you to start to understand these things, and all these decisions have different implications.
And Phil, you said something I thought that was so, first of all, I think it's a great compliment to your skills, but it also explains why that's a great relationship. When the twins of your client say, what does Phil think? Right? What I love about them saying that is they understand there's a planning process around money, and they're kids and they're learning that you do sometimes need to have that outside person to help navigate this. I think if anything, that's probably one of the best financial lessons their parents have probably given them, is that you do need to get someone out there to help you navigate this. And it's incredibly hard today. It's harder today than it's ever been. And I think that's why people are very frustrated. I think that feeds into frustration about why does it cost so much? And we're talking a lot about education, but I think the other thing that planning folks should focus on is, dealing with aging parents, right? I mean, there's been a lot more press about it recently. But most people, and myself included, are ham and egging it, right? Trying to just keep it together when you're caring for an aging parent. And I think it's good to at least discuss it and at least start to try to have a framework so that as things play out, you're not caught flat-footed. I think one of the hardest challenges on the caring for aging parent side, sort of like education, is it's actually finding quality care at a reasonable price. And it's just like education. How do you find quality education at a reasonable price? And I think it's interesting that these same questions are coming up in different areas of planning, whether it's childcare, caring for aging parents, funding education. And then, oh, by the way, you got to fund your retirement yourself on top of that. So it's hard today. And I think decision making and Jeff talked about this on the podcast, on the interview, and Phil's talking about it. I think that's where people succeed, is they have a good process around their decision making.
It's interesting. I was thinking about, as you're both talking, that I was thinking about, like, when I grew up. I mean, things were a lot slower, right? I'm a Generation Xer, and things were a lot slower. We didn't have the internet. Like, just decisions were more thoughtful. You didn't need to make them lickety split. But I also remember that while you did have professionals like accountants and attorneys and financial advisors, you didn't need a specialist for every single decision. Like, if you're trying to get your kid into the right college and choose the right college and have it be the right cost and spend the least and all the stuff that's involved in the college experience, like, you need a specialist now. Like, growing up, it was like, I don't know, you just applied to a bunch of schools and that's just what you did, right? And you're like, oh, you need to get better at test taking. Well, if maybe you were on the cusp or whatever, and your parents wanted to spend a little to get a tutor, okay, you get your test scores up a little bit and whatever. I know I did that. I was terrible at academic test taking, so just like I had to take that just to like bump them up. But not everybody did that. Now everybody does that. You have to do that, right? And so it's just kind of gotten into this world of this super competitive world of like, well, now everyone needs a college specialist. Not everybody gets one, but because I don't think everybody knows that they exist, but you need one. Like, I would feel insufficient as a parent if I didn't go down that path now because everyone else is doing it. It's like, the world has sped up. It's like kids, like growing up, you just played sports. If you were good, you kept playing, and the better you got, the higher you went. Now every kid has like a personal coach at the age of 4, and they're trying to get in the best programs and all this. It's like, what the heck?
like it takes the fun out of the process. So like I feel like all of life is this way. Like when I grew up, you go to the doctor and the doctor, hey, well, we'll check this out. We'll see what it is. And they figure it out. Now everyone's a specialist. Like if you need something done, oh, you got diabetes or you got, arthritis, whatever it is. It's like, oh, you need a specialist in that. Let me point you to this person who only does this small sliver. And if it's outside that sliver, they have no idea what's going on. It's like the book Range, where they talk about Tiger Woods or like chess masters. They're a mile deep, but an inch wide, right? Versus other people who are a mile wide and an inch deep, right? And there's values to both. And so I kind of look at this and I'm just like, it's really hard to make good decisions now. It's almost required that you have a specialist in the area that you're looking at because things have gotten so complicated. And all three of us, we all work in finance, we all work in investments, wealth management. The industry's always been complicated, but I feel like it's getting even more so because of all the different, let's say Wall Street's gotten better at marketing and framing and robo-advisors and all this stuff that's come out. I'm not sure how much has changed. It's always been complicated in my view, but I feel like for individuals, it seems to be getting more complicated because there's just more choice. Whereas when I started, it was like, well, everybody could work with a financial advisor, but not everybody did. And you could just start doing it yourself. I mean, that started in the mid 90s when everyone was doing it themselves. You have access now, but like in the 80s, you didn't have not everybody had access. So I mean, things have changed a lot. So I feel like nowadays you have to be really good at making smart decisions, and you have to have really good decision making skills. Uh, you have to have good frameworks, because if you don't, you get caught up in this, oh crap, I didn't know things work this way. I'm SOL, and now we're behind. And so you really need to, I think, in any aspect of life, with finance especially, when we're talking about college today, you need to have really good decision-making processes. So I know in the interest of time, we got to kind of wrap it up here, but final thoughts from you, Phil.
So the college decision, it's a really hard one, and it should be made as a team. But one thing I want to bring up too, as you're talking about this too, like in the idea of going out and getting help, it's something else that Jeff touched on, is confirmation bias. When you're looking for help and trying to, especially if you're doing things on your own, make sure that you find people on both sides. Because if you don't, you only find people that agree with you or only pointing you in one direction, you're going to miss things. That applies whether you're investing or any other decision you make. It's always important to understand the other side. And in today's world, where you can go to on social media and you can find people that agree with you, and you can go down this narrow track, and you're never going to see anything else. Always keep an open mind. It's a really big part of this. Just like you talk about college, the best school for you doesn't have to be the most expensive school. It's the best school for you. It's not the best. It's not the school that everybody thinks is the best. It's the best school for you. Like, I know my daughter just went through this process, and right near the end, we thought she was going to a different school. The night we were going to submit the deposit, she came and said, "What would you think if I changed my mind?" Like I said, she's going to James Madison. I was really happy that she did, because when I looked at the schools that we did, I knew that was the best place for her. And it just took her a little bit of time to realize it, because they might not have been as strong in what she wants to study, but they were strong enough, and it was the right place for her. So that's it. It's what's right for you. It's not what's right for everybody else. As for me, I know that experiencing big life transitions can be stressful, and my job is to help empower women facing new beginnings with the financial knowledge and tools they need to make self-assured decisions. My firm is Apprise Wealth Management. We'd love to get to know you. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can download our free ebook, How to Flourish Through Life's Big Changes, at apprisewealth.com/ebook, and you can also sign up for our blog. Thanks for having me today, Kirk. I enjoyed the discussion, and good to see you again, Megan.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Phil. And by the way, you should have stuck at Duke, because going from 10,000 to 90,000 was a really good investment. Try to do that in the markets. All right, Megan, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I think that having the right financial decision making in place allows you to do something as well that is financial prioritization. It's so hard to understand what should take priority over another when you're making financial decisions or life decisions. And I think having an advisor or somebody who can really be with you over the long term really can help reflect your philosophy and your values in your decision making. So you can, and by the way, I talk about some of this in my new book. So you can find my new book, All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Govern Their Money, at Amazon or at my website, allthepresidentsmoney.com. And I'm Megan Gorman. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Megan. Glad to have you back on the show, and look forward to seeing more of you. I know the listeners who have not bought Megan's book, please do. I've started reading it. It's phenomenal. Like I said, I would really like to see some of the more recent presidents in there, but maybe you couldn't get the data because it was a little too obscure. Maybe, but anyway, we'll get into that. But I did find it fascinating in reading some of those because I think it's as we kind of look back at leaders and what they've done, there's some really good stories in there. So pick that up. We'll have you on as a guest, kind of talking about that at some point as well.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.